sit down and then I'll just introduce you and then yeah. All right, welcome back to lunch, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Migdalia, who's here from Cornell University, and she's talking about grief attachment theory and the costly function puzzle. So join me in welcoming Migdalia.
Thank you. Okay, let me set my timer. Okay. So, I think there's something going on with this. Yeah, good. So this is the plan for my presentation today. So first, I just want to make a clarificatory note in terms of the language that I'm using for this presentation about the difference between grief and mourning and why I decided to talk specifically about grief and I'm not going to say much about mourning. Then I'm going to present the puzzle of duration, which is this this puzzle that has been raised relatively recent in the emotional literature. I'm going to present two possible responses to that puzzle, responses that I called rationalizing theories of grief. And then I'm going to say a little bit about why I think those two solutions fail in solving the problem, but not only fail in solve the puzzle of duration, but they also raise what I think is a more interesting puzzle, which is what I'm calling in this paper the costly function puzzle. And then I'm going to present a solution based on attachment theory and ethological approaches. Then I'm just going to go through some conclusive remarks. Okay, so I think we need, again, yeah. Sorry, okay. Okay, so first a clarificatory note. So in this paper, I'm taking grief to be a psychological state of distress and mourning a social ritualistic practice. So this is a distinction that comes basically from anthropology. So the first part of the 20th century, mourning and grief were used interchangeably, mainly because, well, in 1917, we have mourning and melancholia from Freud. And from that point on, psychologists were talking interchangeably about mourning and grief. And then in the 50s, early 60s, anthropology started saying, well, you can actually have social practices of mourning without any particular state of distress. So I'm going to talk about grief, not about mourning. Okay, so now what's this puzzle of duration? So, well, something interesting is that the literature on grief has kind of exploded in the past 5-6 years, especially after the pandemic. And a lot of this literature is focused in this puzzle. So the puzzle goes like this. So first, the object of grief is the death of a loved one. The duration of an emotion depends on the duration of its object. Death involves permanent loss. Therefore, we should not stop grief. Of course, in this puzzle, there's an underlying assumption, which is that our emotions can rationally change in response to changes in the qualities of the emotion's intentional object. So people like Agnes Haller, for example, have raised the exact same puzzle in the case of anger. So the reason why you're angry at me is because I did X, and the fact that I did X is going to be true forever because it's something in the past that we cannot change. So therefore, you have the same reason forever to be angry at me. So we have the same puzzle in the case of death because, well, basically, well, we cannot change events in the past and we cannot revive people, right? But then the problem is that that puzzle, or the idea that we should grieve forever, that we rationally should grieve forever, is contrasted with what psychologists call the standard trajectory of grief. So it turns out that we are surprisingly good at just overcoming grief, that we move on really fast. So the standard trajectory is something along the lines of this testimony in one of George Bonanno's books. So this is a woman that lost her partner and now she's along with her 3 kids. So she says, I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, but I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. the days passed, and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there, and we stayed together. So again, it seems that we are very, very good at just overcoming death, tragedy. We're just kind of wired to recover. Now, well, there have been several responses to this puzzle. I'm just going to focus on two particular recent responses. So one is Michael Chelby's in his recent book on grief. So he says, grief is essentially self-oriented. Grief is what happens when another's death is meaningful directly for the bereaved. And what unites all those for whom we grieve is what I call practical identity investment. So we grieve for those towards which we have some kind of investment in terms of who we are, or people that are central for our personal identity. So then what Chelby says is the relationship crisis engendered by another's death is simultaneously a crisis in practical identity. Grief varies in its intensity, tenor, and duration precisely because relationships vary in their intensity, tenor, and duration. So the way in which Shelby is solving the puzzle is saying, well, the thing is that the object of grief is not that someone died, but the fact that someone dying engenders a relationship crisis with that person. So the process of grieving is a process of relationship transformation. That's his solution. Then we have a second response. This comes from Marusic. So he says, the main reason why my grief diminished so quickly seems to be that I was wired to move on. If my initial grief had not diminished significantly and quickly, I would have gone to pieces. That is why it makes very good sense that I would be wired in a way that my grief would diminish. So both in this book and in an early 2015, 2018 papers, he's talking about his process of grieving his mom. He raised very interesting ethical questions about the obligation to grieve, but I mean, if someone is interested, we can talk about it in Q&A. But for this particular paper, I'm interested in this idea that we are wired to move on. So he says, well, one way to explain people's resilience is by appealing to Piaget's idea of accommodation. So following Piaget, Marusic asserts that we accommodate ourselves to loss when we modify our cognitive structures so as to incorporate a new experience or piece of information. So basically, he's taking this Piaget framework of learning to say, well, what happened in grief is that we experience a significant change in our environment, and our cognitive structures just accommodate and change to, well, to re-accommodate this big new change in our environment. Now, well, my answer to that question is no, I don't think they succeed. I think they do not succeed for many reasons, and we can go into detail about how those, I mean, I know someone here is talking about grief and has also worked on Chelby's book, so we can talk more about the specificities of each account. But I think in general, there are two main reasons why these are unsatisfactory responses to the initial puzzle and unsatisfactory accounts of grief. So the first is that their accounts do not allow us to distinguish the specificity of grief's phenomenology in cases of grieving the dead. So both the relationship crisis account and the cognitive accommodation account, I think that those are very expansive concepts of grief, and we could accommodate different types of loss. Losing a partner because of a romantic breakup, losing health, losing a job. And that can be seen as an advantage, but I think that we have a lot of evidence about the phenomenological specificity of grieving the death, about how, for example, it's different when you lose your partner to divorce and when you lose your partner to death. So I think that those accounts fail in actually giving us a good explanation for those specific phenomena. And also, their responses fail to account for cases of grief in young children and in non-human animals. I'm particularly interested in the non-human animal case So there's a recent field of study called comparative thanatology, which is the comparison of reactions to death among different species. And we have a lot of evidence that there are not only reactions to corpses, but reactions to the loss of a member of a pack in different animals, especially in large mammals. But the thing is that these rationalizing accounts are, well, both Cholby and Marusic, I think, are very demanding in terms of saying, well, grieving is about reconstructing your personal identity or reaccommodating your cognitive structures. Whereas I think there's a core definition or a core account of grief that could accommodate the fact that, well, grief seems to be a widespread phenomenon across species. But, well, I not only have criticisms to these views, but I think there's something good, especially in Marusic's account, which is, I do think that he's right when he says that we are wired to move on, or that the fact that we overcome grief very fast seems to say something about who we are. But of course, that leaves us with a big question, which is, what does it mean to say that we are wired to move on? Well, Marusic is talking about grief in humans. I think that we should think about this question, and we think about this we in more expansive terms, including, well, we have evidence of elephants, of prairie voles. We have pretty heartbreaking evidence with dolphins and orcas. So I think that that's kind of my main, well, one of my main claims in this paper, and is that we should aim to talk about grief in a kind of cross-species way. Okay, but then I think that that question leaves us with a second and bigger puzzle than the first one, which I call the cuddly function puzzle. So this puzzle goes something like this. So the universality of grief, or, well, how widespread grief is among humans and non-human animals, suggests that grief was not selected against by natural selection. So of course, well, it's kind of a fallacy to say, well, the fact that this trait is universal means that it has a function. That's a fallacy. But at least the fact that we have this widespread reaction might suggest that at least it wasn't something selected against. But at the same time, grief usually involves detrimental behavioral tendencies such as loss of appetite, loss of sexual drive, and suicidal ideation. And something that I find particularly interesting is that those detrimental behaviors are something that we can find in different species. So there's this famous case of Tahlequah. So Tahlequah is this orca in the Pacific Northwest. This was in 2018. And she was found to carry around her dead calf for 17 days. So that's an incredibly long period of time because she wasn't feeding herself. Also because of the state in which the corpse was, that it was getting rotten pretty fast. She contracted an infection and she was unwilling to give up on her dead cat. So it seems that, well, there are even cross-species reactions to grief that seems to be quite maladapted. So then I feel that, well, I think that there is a solution to this puzzle, or at least, well, like a possible way out of this puzzle that was proposed in the 50s, 60s, and that is surprisingly absent from the current discussion on grief in philosophy, which is attachment theory, and in particular, the intersection between attachment theory and the early ethological studies. So I'm not going to go into detail in the history of attachment theory. I just want to say a few things kind of to locate the theory, especially because of how absent it is from current discussions. But we can talk more about the specificity of the development of attachment theory in Q&A. So attachment theory, well, the main, like the founders of attachment theory are John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, particularly John Bowlby, with the 3 volumes of attachment loss and depression that he published in the 60s. And attachment theory appears in the intersection of Bowlby's psychoanalytic background and his interaction with the early ethologists. So Bowlby was initially part of the British Psychoanalytic Society. He was in charge of the 1951 report for the World Health Organization about the effect of separation in children. So this was a particular task focused on the evacuated children in 1939 in England, and also children that were subjected to these new hospitalization policies, according to which, to avoid infection, parents and caretakers couldn't see the children for the entire time of the hospitalization. So suddenly we have this population of very young children that couldn't see their parents and primary caretakers for 6 months, 1 year. So the World Health Organization asked Bowlby to just write a report on the effects of those operations in these children. The problem there is that, well, he found out that there are, as we know now, very detrimental effects for the mental health of the children of this operation, and that actually those effects seem to have a big correlation with mental health problems later in life for these children. The problem is that Bowlby didn't have, I mean, he had all the observations, all the results, but he didn't have a good reason why that was the case. Why is the case that these children, in the particular case of the hospitalization policies, they were taken care of. I mean, they were feeding, they were playing with other children, but still, the fact that they were isolated from their families seemed to be particularly detrimental to their mental health. He had his psychoanalytic background, and in a second, I'm going to say a bit more why his psychoanalytic background wasn't enough to explain that observation. But later, he started collaborating, well, especially with Konrad Lorenz and with some other ethologists. And he found out that some of the observations that the ethologists were finding and were doing in terms of animal behavior could correspond to some of the evidence that he had at his disposition. So what was the problem with the psychoanalytic explanation of why are the children so affected by separation from their primary caretakers? So I mean, here I'm portraying psychoanalysis as just like this kind of uniform theory, but of course there were a lot of interesting discussions about attachment behavior within the psychoanalytic community. But basically, the idea was that attachment behavior is a secondary drive derived from primary survival needs. So the basic example was the baby is not attached to the mom, the baby is attached to the mom's breast because, well, he's feeding from this object. So that was the explanation for object attachment. But on the other side, we had ethologists saying, well, some specific behaviors are fixed action patterns activated by environmental triggers. So one of the examples is Lawrence goslings. So goslings, well, they found out that they have this imprinting fixed action pattern, so they just follow around the first big object that they see. So there are all these famous pictures about Lawrence being followed around by these goslings. And we also have Harry Harlow's rhesus monkeys studies. Well, this was a bit cruel, but so he separated these little rhesus monkeys from their moms, and then he gave them the choice to go towards this wired mom that was very like easy to feed from, but it was just like a wired thing, or he could go to this kind of fluffy figure that was similar to their moms. And well, what he found is that rhesus monkeys usually tend to go just directly to the fluffy figure that's in like their moms and not to the object that they can feed from. So then what happened is that one of the observations that were particularly difficult to explain for Bowlby using psychoanalytic theory is that children become attached to figures that do not satisfy any primary need. So not only the fact that on the one hand, in the case of the hospitalized children, they were covered in terms of all their primary needs of like warmth and food intake, and they still have all these detrimental effects. And on the other hand, in the evacuated case, or I mean, especially Anna Freud has a really interesting study with children in concentration camps and how they become attached to each other or to figures that are actually detrimental for them. So it seems that, well, he needed to explain how is that we have attachment even when there's no satisfaction of any primary drive. Okay, so more in detail, what attachment theory is and why I think attachment theory solves this question about how is that we're stuck with grief. So attachment theory proposes an explanation for the propensity of human beings to make strong affectional bonds to particular others. And as a class of behavior with its own dynamic, attachment behavior is conceived as a distinct from feeding behavior and sexual behavior, and of at least an equal significance in human life. And so attachment theory says that the goal of attachment behavior is to maintain certain degrees of proximity to or of communication with the discriminated attachment figure. So again, it's kind of surprising that in the grief literature, attachment theory is pretty much absent. Because, I mean, I guess this seems to almost all of us kind of old news, because yeah, of course, we need human connection, we need like primary caretakers, but by the time that Bowlby was writing this, the main theory about attachment was actually this theory of object attachment of psychoanalysis. So the reason why you're attached to your mom is because you're getting something from it, you're getting food, right? But then what he found out is that there's a specific system, and he thinks about systems in terms of biological systems, which is called attachment system, and has a very specific goal, which is, well, the form of affectional bonds and the continuation of those bonds. So in this theory, then, again, the function of the attachment system is to form an affectional bond and to maintain that affectional bond. So according to Bowlby and the later people that subscribe to the attachment theory, the distress response to separation from an attachment object promotes the reunion with such object. So there are like very specific behaviors like crying or screaming or following around that has to do with the fact that, well, we need to find a way to reunite with our attachment object. And so something that is interesting is that common grief reaction among adults are the tendency, often, though not always unconscious, to search for the lost person in the hope of reunion, and something that has been mislabeled denial, but that is called disbelief, which is, well, there's actually a very beautiful example about this in Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. So she's writing about her grieving process after her husband died from a heart attack, like out of the blue. And then she's saying, well, I was getting rid of all his objects, and then she finds her running shoes. And she said, I cannot get rid of these shoes because I think he's gonna need them. And she's not delusional. She's just, I mean, she knows how crazy it sounds, the fact that she cannot just throw away the shoes that he's gonna need, but she still has this reaction of, he's gonna need this object. And she knows his husband is dead, but she has this very deep reaction of, I need to take care of this person and their objects. So something that I find interesting is that the reactions to the reaction that corresponds to the distress response are very similar, if not exactly the same, the grief reactions in terms of trying to find reunion with the attachment object. So then this is what I think, this is a solution or a possible solution to this puzzle. So what I want to say in this paper is that grief is the byproduct of the attachment system or the cost of commitment, since we preserve the responses even when the reunion is not possible. So my solution is the following. The attachment system has a particular function, which is to form and maintain affectional bonds. to maintain those bonds, well, we need some kind of behavior or reaction that help us to go back to this attachment figure. But, well, we preserve those reactions even when the reunition is not possible. So that's what I think that grief, and here I'm not talking, I mean, we can talk more in Q&A about prolonged grief disorder, this recently added psychiatric disorder to the DSM. I'm talking about the standard trajectory of grief or the non-pathological cases of grief. One of the reasons why I think that grief is not the function of the attachment system, but is not a dysfunction as such, but the byproduct of a functional system is that the cost of a false negative is higher than the cost of a false positive. So the cost for Talecua de Orca to just get rid of her cat that seems to be dead is higher than the cost for her to carry around her dead cat for some days. Why is that? Well, sometimes orcas, when they're born, they need a little push to the surface to breathe. It's also the case with dolphins. So sometimes, well, the dolphin mom or the orca mom needs to carry around the recently born calf and push them up so that they can breathe. And, well, also a common reaction in grief that has to do with this belief is that people try to revive the person that just died. There are very certain cases of people that keep the body in their houses for some days, trying to do something to revive them. So I think that, well, that sounds heartbreaking, but that is less costly than just giving up very quickly of our pack members. So I do think that if it does not diminish over time, it can become dysfunctional. And, well, that's the case of prolonged grief disorder. Again, we can talk a bit more about this particular case. But as such, grief is, I don't think it's dysfunctional. And the idea is that it just, I mean, I would like to see my paper as a deflationary account of grief, or just saying grief is just this thing that we're stuck with, but it doesn't have a particular function. And it doesn't have these particular rationalizing functions of changing your identity, changing who you are, or the kind of things that Cholby and Marusic suggests. Okay, just some conclusive remarks. So in theorizing about grief, we should take into account the biological underpinnings of the phenomenon. So one of the reasons why I think that comparative thanatology and the evidence from comparative thanatology is so important is that, well, because we can see that grief is not just this very complex human process, but it's something that we can find across species and that we can learn a lot from that approach. Also, well, ethology in particular provides advantageous methodological and theoretical approaches to both grief and attachment. There's a reason for this, and is that, well, the principle of ethology is to see the species in their natural environment. In doing research on grief in humans is particularly challenging because, well, what are the lab settings that you can create for recreating actual experiences of grief? That sounds like any ethical committee would approve something like that. So there's a reason why investigating grief in their natural environments is a more useful approach. And also, well, I think that current discussions on the temporality of emotions can benefit from a closer look at the history and philosophy of ethology, and in particular, I think that looking at how attachment theory tries to answer a question that comes from psychoanalysis, the question about the bond between the baby and the primary caretaker, through this scientific lens of ethology, is something that we should learn from. And yeah, that's it.
All right, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So what is thank you. I thought it's great. Very interesting. So, it strikes me as not
entirely surprising, although they're not back up, but the kind of examples that have put the real examples are like matriarchal mathematics, like ancient grandmother elephants in that. And it also kind of the attachment theory comes out of children. Are examples of mammals. I mean, partners. But they're months, mammals, carrying around their parts. And they're numerous examples. That is not Migdalia or carrying around the density partners. So one question I want to ask you was about, well, now I've asked what is about this marriage? The one really interesting. So as you say, I'm probably speaking to someone from their experience. But you know, like you listen around, miscarriage, pregnancy loss, I should say, creates, I think, genuine, found lost issues. But of course, one thing that's interesting about the pregnancy loss phenomena is that it's a stretch that there's another that you're attention to. So one of the kind of how that theory. The other thing I want to go is can't some of what people say, some of the people you're criticizing, fit together a little bit more than you suggest right now. So with your kind of model, like, it strikes me as extremely close. Particularly two quite complex psychological things that all of our biological systems, right? Like asking wax lyrically, wax I don't wax lyrically, and I'll it's difficult to hear. Oh, I'm difficult. Sorry. Is it on? Red button? Is it better now? Okay, so you have to repeat the question to go back. Right, so it seems compatible, but it is of attachment, but nonetheless, the identity reconstruction aspects just are like human sophisticated cognitive capacity way of realizing, interpreting, etc., 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 just as we interpret attachment, love in all sorts of complex ways.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So about the miscarriage case, so there are Bowlby's theories from the 60s. So there are some things about his theory, and in particular his account of grief, that has been debunked, like the idea, well, although that was his collaborator, Mary Ainsworth, that came up with this idea of the stages of grief, that there are 5 stages and we go through one and all. I mean, that's totally, well, it's actually more complex than that. And there's in particular someone, she's a professor at UCSD, Monique Wonderly. She works on attachment theory, or like a modern version of attachment theory. And in her account, you can be attached to ideas. I feel a bit weird with how expansive is that idea of attachment, because, well, she said that you can grieve, for example, the future that you're not gonna have. So you apply for this job, you imagine this future in this job, you don't get the job, and then the process of like processing these loss, she called it grief, precisely because you were attached of this imaginary future. I think that's very interesting, but I think that's a bit quite far from the original functional framework of Bowlby's theory. So one advantage is that she can easily accommodate the miscarriage case, saying, well, of course, once you know you're pregnant and if you decide the baby, you start thinking about names, I don't know, saving for college, like doing all these like forward looking thing. So that's a possibility. But there's also some evidence that shows that the stage of the pregnancy, which is not surprising, the stage of the pregnancy when you miscarriage has a lot to do with the duration of the grief. So if it is in the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 months is different. If it is like a very, very late stage in the pregnancy, even worse if like you give birth and then in a few days the baby died. So I think that like, well, yeah, on the one hand, there are theories that can accommodate that case, but there's also, so I don't think that my account of grief is trying, or I don't want to account for every possible loss, or every possible way in which loss can create distress. So I that's why I want to restrict my paper to the case of grieving the death. Of course, the miscarriage case is very complicated because, like, anyway, there are a lot of questions about like if the fetus is a person, and yeah, because I think that, as I was saying, one problem with Cholby's and Marusic theory is that it's too expansive and you can accommodate for different kinds of loss. Which the reason why I think that's problematic is that we have very good evidence that the phenomenology of, for example, losing your partner to death or your partner being missing is very different. Like the process, the distress, the process of overcoming that kind of situation is very different for the families of missing people than for the family of someone that is actually dead, or the family of someone that is in a state of coma. So I think that we have at least empirical reasons why we should want a theory for the specificity of grieving the dead. And no, I do agree that what we do when we grieve is very complex, and we do all these kind of identity reconstruction things. But I think that the way in which it's portrayed in the literature is that it comes from this presumption that comes from Freud, which is the idea of the grief work, or that grief is something that you have to do, and it has the function of being detached from the other person. I think that a lot of things can happen when you grieve, but that doesn't mean that that grief as such has a function.
Okay, so question a little bit like short and sweet because we have not so much time left. But Zach is next, and then the lady behind Zach.
Is this on?
I think so.
Yeah.
Great. So my question is somewhat of a follow-up. I worry that your account is in a similar spot with respect to the two accounts that you criticize, because in cases like divorce or like a really nasty breakup, right? Reunion with the attachment, you know, that the person you might recognize like that's not possible, you know, like it's over, right, in a very significant way. So I wonder, how does your account differentiate that from death? And then the second part of it, I think, involves this kind of like it seems like we not only interpret our attachments, but like intervene in a way that makes them like specific and responsive to reasons. And I wonder, like, and I think it sounds like you want your account to accommodate that sort of thing. So do you have ideas about how you would do that? Thank you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, thank you. So about the first question, well, actually, in the psychotherapy literature, I mean, it's true that we use grief for a lot of things. There's actually some recent work on people that talk about grieving your youth, like the process of aging as a process of because there are things in a very strict sense that you can no longer do. So I don't know exactly how to accommodate that kind of cases. The case of divorce, I mean, I think that something that is interesting is that part of the differences, at least in the psychotherapy settings, is that it's very different when you do a grief therapy for someone that is grieving the death that for someone that is going divorce, in a sense, because, well, part of what is difficult in a very nasty breakup is understanding the impossibility of being with the other person, or understanding the impossibility of, well, I don't know, recovering the relationship. Or so part of the process is, I don't know, like part of the very basic therapeutic strategies is, well, erase her phone, or like, I don't know, block her in social media, or things that you definitely don't necessarily have to do when the person is dead, because there's a very clear reality there. And sometimes actually that's one of the reasons why the grief of people that are looking for their family members is, I mean, it's usually worse, which, so there's, it is called ambiguous loss, when you don't, I mean, you don't even know if the person is alive, if it is well, so like, so I don't think this is a good answer to your very good question, but at least there is some evidence about how, in terms of treatment, people require different things regarding the cause of the loss. And I forgot your second question. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you for this. You were just bringing ambiguous loss, which was one of my questions. And I wonder why you want to limit your theory to the cases of death. I don't think that really helps you, because if you do that, you have to have both the knowledge of death of somebody, which you do not have in the case of ambiguous loss, and you have to put a pretty heavy weight on phenomenology of grieving for that person, which phenomenology differs not only psychologically among us all, but culturally and historically. So your theory is then hostage to all kinds of empirical pieces that may undermine it, not for the reasons which differentiate your position from the position of your opponents, but for reasons which are equally relevant for all of you. And finally, it seems that there is something continuous between cases of different kinds of loss, so that contemporary attachment theory is sensitive to that rather than overreaching, I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, that's an excellent suggestion. I don't, yeah, I mean, no, now that you said, I mean, I think that the main reason why I've been kind of stubborn in restricting the theory to the case of death is, well, the fact that we have a lot of like different evidence and the phenomenology of, but you're absolutely true that, well, since this is a philosophy paper and not an anthropology or sociology paper where I can actually, I don't know, gather some data and discuss like heavily with the empirical sciences, it doesn't make sense to be that kind of open to just counterexamples and to say, well, like, actually the evidence is more complex than you're saying. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, I mean, or in our concept of loss, I do think that loss and grief are different. No, but I mean, thank you really much. I mean, that's a really good suggestion. Yeah.
So last question goes to Arjun. So British.
Yeah. So you proposed two puzzles, right? And the first puzzle is a problem for Cholby and Arias. And then the second puzzle isn't a problem for anyone. But your account speaks to the second puzzle. And I wonder about what it says about the first puzzle, because presumably detachment is endless as well. So how does your theory address the first puzzle?
Yeah, so about the first puzzle, so I think that, well, I mean, I think that Marusic does offer a very straightforward answer, which is that's the kind of creatures that we are. We are the kind of creatures that move on. I do think that's a satisfactory answer. I think that what's missing from Marusic's account is a good explanation of what does actually mean. I mean, what does it mean that we're wired to move on? Well, that's one thing. The other thing is that, I mean, even though we are wired to move on, it is not so clear to me that it's not true that we don't grieve forever, at least in a sense. Like, I mean, you're not gonna forget about the fact that your mom is dead, and maybe you're gonna have some days that are more difficult to others. So I think that my straightforward answer would be that I don't think that that first puzzle is what we should be spending our time on. Well, that's not that straightforward. Yeah, but I think that, I mean, I'm fine with the answer of, well, and the thing is that, well, if you go with a functional account, there's a point in which the why question has to stop, because it's not like, well, why we have this trait? Well, because it does this. And why we need to do this? Well, because it like improves feeding, but like we're not gonna get the ultimate why we are the kind of creatures that we are. And I do think that the best solution to the puzzle is like, well, yeah, that's the kind of creatures that we are, because if we don't like stop the active distress of grieving, well, we cannot just like move on, or would be particularly detrimental.
Great, I said we were out of time, but we're not quite, this is really fast. So I think we can do a couple more questions if anyone has any. Okay, yes. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your talk. This might be a little tangentially related, but I actually think that focusing on the first puzzle might help your view, if I understand it correctly. So I think that focusing on like this temporal duration of grief component could be really helpful for motivating like this attachment theory. Right, so like we typically think that it's pathological if someone's grieving forever for a very, very long time. But we would typically think that it's normal if, say, like a period of time passes, a decade, however long, and someone encounters an object or something that evokes a memory of the person that they lost or something like that. In those cases, we would typically think that like a relapse into a severe state of grief might be normal for some sort of period of time. So like accounting for that, I think that there might be some kind of story you can tell with attachment theory about why we think that those cases of grief are permissible like over time, but why enduring grief might be pathological. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, that's right. And I think I thought about it like saying something about that in this particular paper, but the problem is that, so I feel that's too close to the problem of, there's this big discussion right now about prolonged grief disorder. So, I mean, the diagnostic is already in the DSM-5, but there's still people saying it doesn't make sense to say that grieving pathological, no matter the duration of the grief, precisely because that kind of cases, because 10 years after your mom died, you find objects or things and like feel the same exact distress, and we don't have reason to say that that's pathological. I think that one of the reasons why I'm not saying that much about that particular puzzle is also because, and that's something that the DSM-5 recognizes, the duration question is a cultural question. So there are communities for which the socially accepted amount of time for grieving is 2 days.
But again, this kind of seems like we're back to the distinction that you made at the beginning between like these cultural practices of grief and like grief itself is an emotion or an affective state, right? I think that there's this debate in the literature, right, that you've kind of like flagged about whether it's appropriate to grieve forever, given that we typically accept that like our emotions are fitting in some way to the external world, and this loss is permanent, this loss is forever. Yeah, I don't know, maybe this is going to be like a little bit too tangentially related, but I do think that there's a story that you can tell with your view about prolonged grief that might actually help motivate its plausibility. That's all.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna just read out loud one of the questions in the chat, then I think we can end with that. So, oops, sorry. So this is from Safia. So she says it would be interesting to hear how religion or faith plays into this, and belief in an afterlife, and being reunited with someone who has passed. So wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So I haven't explored that literature that much. There are studies about how very religious people react to grief. I know at least about one study with Buddhists, and it turns out that the religious belief doesn't affect how painful the loss is. So even if you, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know there's a literature on this, and I know there's conflicting evidence. So there are people that say, well, actually, if you believe in an afterlife, that is not that painful. But there's actually a lot of evidence that shows that that's not the case. Even if you're a priest, even if you are in a high position in some kind of religious institution, or like you spend your whole life studying the afterlife and it's something that you really believe in, the pain of loss seems to be exactly the same as for anyone else. So like there might be difference in coping mechanisms with that loss. So it might be different in the sense that you can have, for example, a religious community. So I think that a confounding factor of some of the studies that show that religious people grieve less is the community factor. So it might not be the belief in the afterlife, but the fact that you have a strong community around you, and that you have a lot of, well, religious practices or social practices, and you meet with people all the time and people cook for you. And so I feel that that might be a factor there, but that's a literature that I haven't explored that much.
Great. Please join me in thanking our speaker.